If you're new to my channel, my name is Jade Amani, and today I'm talking about my college experience at the University of California, San Diego, also known as UCSD. To give you a quick summary, I immigrated to the United States when I was in my mid-teens and completed high school online after being in-person school for my whole life. I was undocumented, and so I was very limited in terms of my options in terms of academic institutions, because undocumented students often would have a harder time being considered in state. As an undocumented student, you are often looked at like, oh, you're an international student, and so they start looking at your financial records as basically a means to decide if you can even afford to attend the school. They really aren't considering you someone who resides within the United States, and that really can affect the types of places that will admit you. So coming from a lower income situation and also not having documentation, I had very few options. My dream might have been Brown University or, some kind of liberal arts institution where I could explore my interest in writing, but that wasn't my options. My option was UC San Diego because I was in state and because they had admitted me. Let me begin with the most important topic when you're looking at schools, which is academics. UC San Diego is a very strong school for STEM subjects. I wasn't STEM, and so it wasn't great for me. I was a political science major with a concentration in public law. I entered UCSD with that major declaration and I left with that degree. I definitely would say that if you are looking at UCSD, if you're a prospective student, that the political science department is better for international relations. I would also say it's not a very diverse department. I believe there is only one member of the department who is black, and to my knowledge, they do not teach any poli-sci classes. So you're not getting a huge amount of diversity in terms of professors. Most of the political science professors at UC San Diego are, older white men, and that's just something to keep in mind. It is relevant to your education. It isn't sort of a surface level thing. The experiences that you have as a student of color are impacted by your professors. Ultimately, it is harder to make and maintain professor relationships when they don't really view you a certain way. And so I would definitely say that this was at least one of the factors in making my academic experience perhaps not the one I envisioned for myself. When I was going into college, I had envisioned a very rigorous and challenging academic environment, and I was very ready for it. As I've said in one of my YouTube videos, I was definitely someone who was interested in social justice and theory and that kind of thing, and I really didn't get any of that out of my political science degree. I did get it in some of the other classes I took, and so I really think the humanities classes were a lot stronger. I had a very cool professor for an intro to Asian American literature class. I had an incredible professor for a Gothic literature class, which really looked at criminality as a concept and Foucault and just really interesting lenses for analysis. But overall, I would say that I didn't get the academic environment that I was hoping for. I don't think I was particularly challenged as a student at UC San Diego, and maybe other majors and other folks wouldn't have that experience. I just think for myself, even if there were a lot of readings and a lot of writing, it wasn't particularly challenging to me. I often felt like I had kind of already an understanding of a lot of the topics that we were talking about, or even maybe some of the court cases, and so I wasn't getting a whole bunch, for the bunch of money that I was spending on my education. More importantly, when you have an academic environment, I believe that a very key component is the student relationships, and so the way that student life feeds into your academic experience. There were a lot of classroom environments that were very uncomfortable. Something that's really relevant about academics is not just the diversity of the faculty, but the diversity of the student body. In nearly every class I took at UC San Diego, I was the only black student in the class, and so that was definitely something that could feel daunting.
Here we go.
One of the defining things, like the defining thing with UCSD was racism. So let's begin with a little story time. In my freshman year of college, I was living on the on-campus housing, and I had like 5 roommates. This roommate I had, she would say the N-word all the time. To be clear, this girl, she was Asian American, and every other sentence she would end with the N-word. Like, she would be calling her friends the N-word all the freaking time. And so I called her out for it, and I said, like, please stop saying this, which you'd think she would be embarrassed. The response was basically that I was overreacting and that I was just like woke. I did this several times. I brought it up and I was like, hi, stop using the N-word. You aren't black. Stop. My roommates knew she was doing this as well, and they all were like, oh yeah, we think it's like bad that she does that. I ended up telling her this kind of hackneyed thing. Like, this word was the last word that so many black people heard in their lives. She just went, that's so dramatic. And she just used the N-word for the rest of the time. And yeah, that was my story time. Actually, no. There is one other thing about this girl that I just have to bring up, because it would be almost, it would be funny if this was not the case. She had the pre-existing belief that essentially she hadn't gotten into like UCLA and these other schools because black people had taken the spot from her. When it came to the end of our first quarter, she asked what my GPA was, and it was a 4.0. I had a 4.0 pretty much through my whole first year of college. And she got so mad that she like didn't speak to me for several days and was just like in her room just steaming about the fact that her narrative wasn't playing out for her in this particular scenario. And she kind of tried to play it off like, yeah, well, you're not a STEM major. So yeah, that was my racist roommate story time. But roommate story time aside, this was not just one individual. This was a systemic problem at this school. Socially, there's definitely a ton of isolation. It was a school that had a 2% black population. There were about 600 black students in a school that had 30,000 students. So the biggest lecture hall on campus could fit every black student and still have some room left over. Like, one of the issues with UCSD is they have pretty bad policing. That school is very afraid of black and brown students like meeting and organizing, and this is in the history of the school. If you know of Miss Angela Davis, then you might not know about her history with UC San Diego, but it honestly tells you so much. They didn't even want black students to have a resource center until after the Compton cookout, which is yet another example of how anti-blackness manifested itself in UC San Diego. I went to lectures at UCSD and my professors would say blacks in basically every class I had that mentioned black people. I, as a student, would take the extra couple seconds to write down black people in my notes because I recognize myself as a person, but my professors did not have the energy to just say black people. They would always be saying blacks. When I was in my freshman year, it wasn't just that one roommate who was saying the N-word all the time. I also was essentially seen as like a mammy figure. I really was being mammified as a young person, and I realized that a lot of what I thought was people trying to bond with me was actually them just like wanting my support and just seeing me as like a literal mammy. I felt incredibly dehumanized because of my race at this school, and a lot of this is systemic. America is America, and as a British black person, I had to learn race in America, which is different from how race functions in the United Kingdom. And that's not because it doesn't exist. Racism is very prevalent in the UK. It just comes out different. And so I very much had to learn that, and holy Lord, I think anyone who is black who went to college, maybe, like outside of an HBCU, can relate to this. And definitely I just wanted to make this particular part of the video because I had such negative experiences just being like a fat black woman in UC San Diego. I had it from my professors, from my classmates, from the institution. Everything was just set up against black students. I myself have a disability. I have a neurological condition that I'm not going to name on here for privacy reasons. It is degenerative and it does affect my balance, and it does give me a lot of chronic pain and things like that. So it definitely was impacting my ability to get around campus. UCSD is a really huge campus and it's extremely hilly, which is something that I didn't know because I'd never actually visited the campus because I wasn't somebody who could afford to do like college trips. First of all, props to UC San Diego for actually offering a ride system. So basically they have student drivers who will drive you from your apartment or your dorm to your lecture hall or your class, and it was the only way I could get to class. At the same time, there were times as a student that I was denied accommodations that my white peers would get. So one of the things I will say is definitely you have to advocate so hard for yourself, and you have to never take like no for an answer. You really have to question and push your way through getting accommodations when you really need them. One thing that I'll say is really big advice is like, if you have a disability or even if you just get injured, overcome that feeling of shame or of like, I don't deserve this, and try to advocate for yourself. Utilize the Office of Student Disabilities and say, hey, this is going on, and don't be afraid to call them out on bias. Another thing I would say is, if you are someone who thinks you're going to rely on ADA rides to get to class, I was told in my first year by the ADA folks that they would not give me a ride to anything that wasn't a class. And so if you have a disability, on the one hand, UC San Diego is a place that will give you a ride to class, but on the other hand, it's a place where you're going to be denied a ride to get something as necessary as food. And one of the most dehumanizing experiences I've had in my entire life was on the phone with ADA while this woman told me like that I didn't deserve to be able to go and get food, and like basically you can starve. That was so incredibly dehumanizing. My note on accommodations and disability is to advocate for yourself and to not be afraid to speak up. College should be free, college should be universal, but that isn't the case, and so we have to deal with these kind of financial realities. It cost about $30,000 a year for me as an in-state student to attend UC San Diego. There's about a $13,000 tuition, and then you've got housing costs on top of that. I can't tell you that this is ultimately going to be the cheapest option. It was the cheapest option for me. It was the only option that I could afford. One of the problems that I have with UCSD in terms of cost is back when I was a student, they used to force you to buy dining dollars, which was essentially money that you could only use on the campus markets and the dining halls. And like everything in the markets was like 3 times the price it was in Ralph's. So it was incredibly expensive to get things using those dining dollars, and you're also trapped into paying about $2,500 a year in dining dollars. One of the things that I think a lot of people experience that I was aware of, and I definitely experienced, is food insecurity. If you're not aware of what food insecurity is, it is that insecurity about whether or not you can afford to feed yourself. There was a study that was done, and about 41% of students said that they had experienced food insecurity in the past year. This was a survey that was taken in 2019 when I was still a student. 41% is just a staggering statistic when you think that almost half of the students at this school couldn't feed themselves. And I do think that it is part of this other large issue, which is that La Jolla is one of the wealthiest areas in the country. And so you have students who can't feed themselves surrounded by mansions that cost tens of millions of dollars. People joke about being a broke college student, but ultimately this is something that really deeply impacts students at this school, almost half of students, and it's really awful to think that people can't afford to feed themselves when they're trying to get an education, and that the school doesn't do more to ensure that people are fed and that they are kept in their housing. Students really do struggle with finding affordable housing in the area. You have pretty bad public transit, so you are quite limited between University City and La Jolla. I felt the need to talk about something that was a major part of my college experience, which was I experienced an assault and battery when I was a second year student at UC San Diego. This male student was in one of the college clubs I was in, and he essentially abused me for several months. He was a narcissistic abuser. I wanted to talk about this because it would feel disingenuous to leave it out, because ultimately this is something that deeply impacted how I viewed my school. And I did want to talk about what UCSD did in response. The first thing is that I went to the Sexual Assault Resource Center, and I wanted to really promote that for anyone who's watching this who might be a current UC San Diego student or a prospective student, because I think that that resource and having a victim advocate really helped me. And so if you are interested in that, they definitely can help you. I also wanted to talk about the school itself. A problem was that the dean did not communicate the circumstances to professors, and even when my abuser appealed his school sanctions to the provosts, they didn't let me know that that was happening. So a real thing that could have happened is he could have gotten away from that completely, and I wouldn't have known that he'd even done that appeal. And I definitely didn't have that opportunity to speak to the provosts and say, this man did this thing that, you know, has impacted the rest of my life. I'm mentioning this because so many young people, especially young women, become victims of intimate partner violence and other kinds of gendered violence when they're in these college institutions. I want any current and prospective UC San Diego students to know that resources like the Sexual Assault Resource Center do exist, and that it is really valid to feel like an institution didn't do all it could to protect you, because UCSD, like many higher education institutions, really didn't do everything it could and should to protect me. So that included having my abuser in classes with me after he'd done this. So that is just a note on my experience with this very difficult issue. So to conclude this kind of messy video, you know, it's hard to have like a really neat suggestion for you if you are a prospective student. I can't tell you whether you would or wouldn't enjoy attending this school. There are plenty of people who go to UCSD who feel like, you know what, it's not socially dead and I had a great time. A lot of people really do enjoy their experiences at UCSD. I just wanted to be kind of honest about my experience because, you know, I definitely am aware that there aren't like a ton of videos about UCSD, and definitely not a huge amount from, you know, like a Black perspective or the perspective of someone who's not from this country. In terms of advice, I would stress the importance of advocating for yourself and for your community. Always remember your worth. You're just trying to get an education. And it's not your fault that people will come at you trying to attack your humanity. Look for people who are ready to step up for you, and really be critical of the types of things you're joining in and the types of connections that you're making. I think it can be so easy to meet people who will make you feel more alone than if you didn't even know them. A lot of the best experiences that I had were not given to me by the university. You can have a successful kind of career. I think you just have to go out and get it. This isn't a school that's really able to handhold and get you into the door. I also wanted to give like a little mention to the Triton, which is the student-run news organization. I knew some folks who had been a part of that. All of this is to say the biggest advice I can give in this whole video is to just advocate for yourself and for other people, to be creative, to be interesting, and to go do interesting things, and to always like make the opportunities for yourself, you know, if they aren't there. And also just like be flexible or leave. If a situation is bad, trust your inner alarm bells and leave. That could be a frat party that you need to get out of because they have a Confederate flag. That could be, you know, the school itself. Anyway, I have been doing this video for long enough now. I have a Korean drama to watch. I'm gonna drink my wine. Have a lovely day. Goodbye.